Well, it says it up there. Felix Hale, Director of Tax Heritage, UK Museum, Sotheby's, who's going to talk about gain and loss, loss and gain, acquiring and disposing. It says all that in your papers. It's always nice to try and make a connection with the speaker, I think, when you're at a function such as this. But I thought, my God, how can you make a connection with that great international name, Sotheby's, with the fortunes that pass through their hands? And I saw an article in the Times last week saying that Sotheby's had run into a bit of cash flow trouble and were having to pay people in IOUs. Felix tells me that that's a temporary hitch and it's coming out of New York, but actually reading that made me, I find it strangely reassuring that others have cash flow problems as well as the smaller fry. So, Felix, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I would say we're all in it together, but I'm worried that I seem out of touch. Well, thank you so much for having me here in this beautiful room. As Allan described, I'm going to talk to you today about the various ways you can add to your collection works of art and other objects, and how you can go about encouraging these acquisitions. Acquisitions, to my mind, really are the lifeblood of collections. New acquisitions are exciting in their own right, but also, of course, they can re-energize excitement in your existing collection and your museum. Some of you may already be very keen and active acquirers. Some of you, I feel, may be more circumspect and feel that you don't have the money or the resources, both time and financial, to do so. But today I hope to give you some encouragement to acquire, but also to highlight some of the ways that you can go about acquiring without having to dig deep into your pockets. So today I'm going to start off and look at charitable gifts and the various tax incentivized schemes that are out there to help you acquire. And also, as Sotheby's might suggest, talk about auctions. I will then, at the end, talk about the other side of things, which is perhaps more controversial, although in my view should not be so, how you might want to dispose of items from your collections. I'll start off with charitable gifts, and first of all, you must forgive me, but I forewarn you that this talk is going to include quite a bit of tax, and I'm afraid we can't get away from talking about it. Taxation is one of the main mechanisms any country has to encourage a particular type of behavior, and that, of course, extends to philanthropy, which is underpinned by our tax system in this country. So starting off with charitable gifts. Gifts may be cash, of course, or they may take the form of art or other objects. Charitable gifts, I understand most of you will be a charity, are free of tax, and to encourage lifetime giving of cash, you have gift aid. You may all be pretty familiar with this. With gift aid, there is some tax incentive for higher rate taxpayers, and you get an extra 25p in the pound. There's also a scheme called the Cultural Gift Scheme, which I'll come on and talk about in more detail, and that is a scheme to encourage the giving of important art and other objects. On death, too, gifts to charity are free from inheritance tax. I think it's worth, if you are talking to potential donors, reminding them that if they give 10% of their net estate to charity, and that can be both in gifts to you and to other charities, both in cash and objects, they can reduce their overhead rate of inheritance tax from 40% to 36%. So it's worth reminding them to be generous in their wills. You might also, and again, this is probably bread and butter for you, if you are talking to donors and they are wavering about giving now, you might want to consider giving special membership status, for example, to potential donors. I don't want to dwell too long on charitable gifts because perhaps this is what you're thinking about already. So I'm going to move on to the incentivized schemes that are out there. The first of the schemes I want to talk about today is conditional exemption, and this scheme has been going since the late 19th century. Broadly speaking, these allow heritage assets, whatever they may be, to remain in private ownership by exempting them from capital taxes, that's inheritance tax or capital gains tax, subject to the item meeting certain qualification requirements and the fulfillment of certain criteria by the owners. The most important condition that the owners give is to give open public access to these items. Either that can be in their own homes or, and very commonly, in the form of a loan to a museum. The conditional in conditional exemption is important because it's not a true exemption, and if the owners breach their obligations by taking them off public display, typically this happens on a sale, then that tax is triggered. Now, to qualify, this isn't for all objects. They have to meet a certain quality threshold, and this is called preeminence. Preeminence, though, don't think just the great Titian in the National Gallery. Preeminence can be adjudged both in a national and a local context. So if an object has a real significance to your museum, to your particular area, then I think there is a very good chance that the items would qualify under this scheme. To save you from death by text, I thought I'd show one such example of an object that I have assisted with the conditional exemption on, the Anglesey leg. Now, some of you may know about this. This is one of the first articulated wooden legs ever created for the first Marquis of Anglesey, who lost his leg at the Battle of Waterloo. There's I hope not apocryphal story, I think some of you may know it, of as he lost his leg, he was standing next to Wellington, who announced, "By God, sir, you've lost your leg," to which Anglesey's reply was, "By God, sir, so I have." And although in this scheme the objects are remaining in private ownership, I do encourage you, if the opportunity arises, for you to take these loans. The reason for this is because of the tax system. Attached to these objects, the tax enters these objects' DNA, if you will, and they often come as they make excellent candidates for permanent acquisitions down the line on the schemes that I'm about to come on to. The first and most important of these schemes is the acceptance in lieu scheme, which is run by Arts Council England, which allows owners of preeminent objects effectively to sell their object, work of art, whatever it is, to the nation with some exception, at no cost to the museum, to you, which is great. Instead of cash, what the owners get is a tax credit to set against their inheritance tax liability. Although this scheme has great aura of philanthropy, the owners are actually getting an incentive. It's better financially for doing this because they get a tax kicker called a douceur, literally a sweetener. And I would say that this scheme is really the premier scheme in this country for major acquisitions. Owners can offer anything, and that is art. That could be swords, could be tanks. Sadly, I've never done a tank, but I have done a very large steam locomotive. And importantly as well, archives, which I know may be very important to you. So how can you go about encouraging people who'd like your museum to benefit on death, but understandably they may not wish to give away the whole value of their object? First of all, I would say, if you are talking to people who own these objects, you can raise the prospect of the acceptance in lieu scheme. Potential offerers down the line don't need to say that they're going to use the scheme in their will, but the only thing you must be careful of is for them not to say it's a straightforward charitable gift, because then as a matter of public policy, you can't use the scheme. If somebody does approach you to be an allocatee, and as I say, in most cases, this involves you getting the object for free, so I do hope that you would willingly accept, you are expected to write a letter to say how important this object is for your collection, why, what it means for you, and how you might put it on public display or engage in, or go to public engagement. Offers, broadly speaking, are made in three ways. The first way is with a condition attached to it, to the allocation. In other words, I will only make this offer on the condition that it is allocated to the National Army Museum. Two, with a wish as to the allocation. The wish is not binding, but very persuasive. And also, offers could be made without a wish or condition. Now, for you as potential allocatees, the ideal is to have it made conditional. And the way you go about doing that is to forge those relationships, hopefully before death, so that you are having those conversations, you are identifying those objects that may want to come to you, and that is how you can encourage these offers. One very moving offer I was involved with was these 3 drawings by Henry Moore, the shelter drawings which Henry Moore made in tube stations and everywhere they were sheltering from the Blitz. Some wonderful mother and child motifs which you see a lot in there. And these were offered in lieu a few years ago to the Imperial War Museum. I now move on, I'm afraid, to a scheme which does involve you paying some money if the opportunity arises. However, there is an incentive which makes it cheaper for you to acquire in this way. Private treaty sales. Now, this is a form of private treaty sale which the government forgoes all tax on and operates in a very similar way to the acceptance in lieu scheme, in that there is a tax incentive with the douceur, but instead of a tax credit, this is you going about and raising some money. The more tax there is involved, the better it is for you and the greater the discount. There's no real way of doing this, I'm afraid, if you'll forgive me, by looking at some numbers as an example. If the object was worth, say, £100,000, if that had gone to auction and you have to then pay £100,000. However, if you deduct the tax that would have been payable on this sale, in this example I've used inheritance tax, you then deduct the tax amount, you then add on the tax incentive called the douceur, which is typically 25% of the tax that otherwise would have been payable, and then you get the special price of £70,000. So there is an incentive. So for the seller, whereas otherwise they would end up with £60,000 in their pocket, they're getting £70,000, and you, as the acquiring museum, are paying £70,000, not the headline £100,000. So if you can buy this way, this is a fantastic scheme. And here are just a few examples that I've been lucky enough to be involved with over the last few years. From anything from Alfred Wallace sketchbooks, which he sketched from his debtor's prison, to Mary Queen of Scots' silver casket, to an amazing Gentileschi at the National Gallery, and a Gwen John at the National Galleries of Scotland. Now, unfortunately, not all museums can qualify to buy through the private treaty sale scheme. First of all, the object has to be considered preeminent, but as I've said before, don't just think that you'd have nothing in your collection that would qualify. It may well do. Or it must have been previously exempt way back at any point to qualify. But you must also be a museum which is listed in what's called Schedule 3 of the Inheritance Tax Act. Now, if you're unsure, which you may well be, are you one of these? It is a very broad church. It involves all the national museums, every local authority or former local authority museum, any museum associated with a university, and many other categories. However, if you are thinking, how annoying, I definitely am not one of these, then don't despair. This is one of the rare times when another institution is allowed and indeed encouraged to front the sale on your behalf. So other Schedule 3 bodies include some of the funding bodies like the Heritage Lottery Fund and the Art Fund. So if there is the advantage to be had, they can front the sale for you, and so you can qualify. The last of the schemes I'm going to talk about today is the Cultural Gift Scheme. Now, the Cultural Gift Scheme has only been going since 2013 and is not nearly as utilised as the Acceptance in Lieu scheme. This is perhaps not that surprising because the level of tax incentive the donor gets is much less than an acceptance in lieu. This is real philanthropy. In return for a lifetime gift to a museum, the donor will get 30% of the value of the object to set against income tax and capital gains tax, and they can spread that over the course of 5 years. If you're thinking that hoping for a donation from a company, then companies could also benefit too, but they get 20% only against corporation tax. One nice example of this is a cultural gift which we did to the National Galleries of Scotland of 2 Damien Hirst medicine cabinets. If you are thinking about this, it might just be what the owner needs to get a donation over the line, that extra incentive to give. And if you are talking to them about a possible donation, ask, have they considered going through this scheme? How are we doing for time? Plenty. Unfortunately, though, and of course I could not talk about auctions, which is what, of course, Sotheby's is best known for. There won't always be the opportunity to acquire through these schemes. So I will talk to you a bit about the auction process and hopefully give some comfort and some encouragement to dip your toe into the auction world. First of all, how should you be looking out for things? Well, all auction houses will publish a pre-sale auction catalogue, which will mostly be online, and you can also look online and put in, you can also create alerts at the various aggregator sites like the sale room to let you know what's coming up for sale so you don't miss anything important. So then once you've found an object you might be potentially interested in buying at auction, look carefully at the auction catalogue. The lot description will be the first thing. What is this actual thing? And the catalogue will also list provenance. In other words, where has this object actually come from? Particularly important as trustees to know where the thing you're buying from is coming from. It'll also list any inclusion in any literature or any exhibition history. You'll have the estimates. Now, this is the auction range. This is not always the range in which the auction house expects things to sell. So whilst it is a useful guide, if it's very special, it may be that you have to go beyond the high estimate. You could, of course, get it at the low estimate. The very important figure that will not appear in an auction catalogue is the reserve price, which is the price under which the auctioneer will not sell you that object. However, this amount cannot be higher than the low estimate in the catalogue. But it is very possible that you can get works under a reserve, but the auctioneer will usually say or make it clear if he is selling under the reserve, refusing to sell under the reserve. Pay close attention to catalogue symbols, which might refer to tax. They might refer to where you can pick up the lot. They might tell you, indeed, whether the lot is sold without reserve, in which case, not a problem. Funding applications. So once you have identified something, my plea today is don't be put off because you think you haven't got the money, because in my view, the funding is out there. It's hard and it's hard work, but it can be done. Apart from, of course, you may wish to approach private donors, there are places, as I've mentioned before, like the Heritage Lottery Fund, the Heritage Lottery Memorial Fund. I know there are other bodies that you may turn to, local funding, possibly even council funding. But all I would say is try and get your applications in as soon as you can. The Art Fund, for example, do say they can turn around funding within a week. And other people private donors may be even more fleet of foot. But do try and find the money that is out there, and don't just think we do not have the time and resources, because acquisitions are so important. Once you're ready to bid, there are various ways you can do it. You can either turn up to the auction room, which in fact, I'll save you from this text and show one example of some our friends at the Imperial War Museum who came into the auction room and made a day out of it. I think about 4 of them came to win this lavery of Armistice Day. In fact, this is the only painting we know of that was actually painted on the day of Armistice Day, as Lavery went out into London to celebrate and sketched what he saw. And this is now in the Blavatnik galleries at the Imperial War Museum. As well as coming in person, if you don't want to do that, often you can register to bid over the phone. A lot of auction houses, you can now also bid online. You can also, if you don't trust yourself to sit on your hands, then you can leave a commission bid. Now, a commission bid is a maximum bid that the auctioneer will execute on your behalf, up to a maximum. So if you really will not go beyond that, perhaps it's safer to put in your bid and hope for the best. One other piece of advice is it's worth asking the auction house whether they will offer you extended payment terms to give you longer to pay, which can always be helpful if you think you've got the funding identified but need a bit more time to get it in. But do agree this before the sale. Just to go back to the text, just to remind myself, when the auctioneer brings his hammer down, that, I'm afraid, is not the end of the story, and there are other additional costs you should bear in mind. First of all, there's buyer's premium, which is charged on top. We at Sotheby's have dropped our commission to 20% on the first 5 million, but these can range between 25 and 30%, and even if not up to 5 million, but in the hundreds of pounds, there will be significant premium to take into account. They may also have artist resale rights, which are royalties paid to living artists or to their estates if they've died within the last 70 years, but that's only up to a maximum of 12,500. There might be shipping costs to get it to you, and there might be VAT to take into account. If you are registered for VAT, sorry to return to tax, you may be able to recover the VAT if you pay I won't go into details, but pay outside of the margin scheme. In other words, this means you're paying a bit more in total, up front, but it does mean that you should be able to recover the VAT. So just check if you can do that. I've talked for 20 minutes or so about acquisitions, but I've been asked to say a bit about deaccessioning. As I mentioned at the start, this is sometimes considered a more controversial topic, but certainly, in my understanding and speaking to colleagues throughout the museum sector, it is very much at the forefront of people's minds. I probably don't have time to go into full details about it, but perhaps I could go through the general areas that you should consider. The first of these, when you're thinking about disposing of your object, first of all, think about the legal considerations. Check if you can dispose of the object in question. Did, for example, the original donation come with a condition, meaning that it can't be sold? Are you definitely the owner? It sounds obvious, but was it in fact a loan, possibly even from a family hundreds of years ago, and it's not clear whether the family still own it? Could there be any third-party claims? You don't want to be getting into legal wrangling before you've even disposed of it. Does your charitable or museum statutes allow you to dispose? This will depend on how your governance is set up. Do the trustees have the power to dispose? If you are a charity, which I think I can safely assume most are, then you are also tied by the obligations of the Charities Commission to act in the best interest of the charity and exercising due care and diligence. So do just think about your normal trustee obligations. Museum accreditation. Now, the next thing you need to consider is, are you an Arts Council England accredited museum, which I know many army museums are, if not all. If you are, then the disposal is governed by the Code of Ethics, which is set out by the Museums Association, who work in tandem with Arts Council to operate the accreditation scheme and deal with deaccessions. Now, the consequence of making what the Museums Association call an unethical disposal is that you can lose your accreditation status, and with that comes a loss of funding, loss of public funding for your museum. There was a very high-profile case at Northampton Museum where another large auction house, not Sotheby's, sold a Sekhmeka statue for a large amount of money, but the museum was then lost its accreditation for 5 years, lost a lot of funding, and in fact, the half of the object was owned by the original family who donated it, so they didn't even get the full proceeds. So you don't want to fall into this trap. If you're not accredited, then actually you don't have to worry about going through this process at all, although actually it's probably worth referring to some guidance to take you through, and these guidelines are useful to refer to. But assuming you are accredited, some of the things you need to be thinking about, which can be found online, are broadly, are you disposing of the item because it doesn't fit into your collections policy? I mean, is it really irrelevant for your collection? If so, move forward. Can you ring-fence these funds for your collections? That's something you'll need to do. You can't, sadly, sell the family silver to fix the roof. Is there a duplicate in your collection? If so, another thing worth considering. It's not an easy process, and it should be entered into advisedly, but the framework is definitely there. And if you do sell, then the expectation is that you will sell at auction because that's considered the most transparent way of doing it. And just to show that we have indeed gone through the whole process, this is just a scrap of paper signed by Elizabeth I, which I helped sell from Louth Museum. One note, though, on deaccessioning: if the object has not been formally accessioned into your collection, and you all have your ways of doing this, then you don't need to follow these rules at all. So in practice, this often happens if somebody, say, leaves you a bequest in their will, but you don't want to take these things, or take them permanently into your collection. I would say don't formally accession them, and depending on the terms of the actual bequest, you should be able to sell them without going through this formal process. Thank you for bearing with me, particularly about tax. I understand I'm going to have time to answer questions in the Q&A after the next talk, unless there are anything burning before that section.
Well, I think we'll stick with the plan, Felix. That's terrific. Thank you. This is all on video to remind you.